At my baby shower, my husband leaned toward his mother and whispered, "Once the baby's here, we don't need her anymore." He didn't know the kitchen had an echo. He didn't know my godmother was standing 3 feet behind him. And he didn't know that the woman he married had spent the last 8 months being underestimated by someone who had confused her patience for permission. I was 31 weeks pregnant, standing in the living room of a house I had paid for, surrounded by people who were smiling at me, while 2 of them were quietly planning to take everything I had. My name is Sophie Marchand. I'm 32 years old, and until a Sunday afternoon in October, I believed I was building a life with a man who loved me. I was wrong about the love part. I was not wrong about the building. I did all of it. I should tell you about Ethan first, because you need to understand how someone like me ended up standing in a kitchen doorway at 8 months pregnant, hearing her husband schedule her obsolescence like it was a calendar item. Ethan Cross was the kind of man who made eye contact when you spoke, who asked follow-up questions, who touched the small of your back when you walked through a door and made it feel like protection rather than steering. I met him at a nonprofit gala 3 years ago. I was there because I ran the event. I was the development director for a regional children's literacy foundation. I'd built the fundraising program from scratch, tripled the donor base in 2 years, and organized the annual gala that brought in $1.4 million that night. Ethan was there because his firm had bought a table. He worked in commercial real estate, brokerage side, which meant he spent most of his time in rooms full of people who measured each other by their watches. He told me later he'd noticed me first because I was the only person at the event who seemed to actually care about the cause, which was a very good line. I understand that now. We dated for 7 months. He proposed on a Tuesday, not because Tuesdays are romantic, but because he'd just closed a deal and was in the kind of mood where everything feels possible. I said yes. My godmother, Diane Reeves, who had raised me after my mother passed when I was 12, said she liked him, but wanted to wait a year before deciding if she trusted him. Diane was a retired family court judge. She had spent 31 years watching people perform for her bench and had developed a very specific radar for the difference between character and presentation. I told her she was being cautious. She said, "Cautious is what keeps you out of my old courtroom." I wish I had listened more carefully. We married in April. The house was mine, a 3-bedroom craftsman in Charlotte that I'd bought with savings and a small inheritance from my mother. It was in my name. The mortgage was in my name. The utilities, the insurance, the property taxes, all mine. Ethan moved in after the wedding. He contributed to groceries and his share of dinners out, and I didn't think much about the fact that I never saw a bank statement with his name and mine on the same page. He said he kept his finances separate for tax purposes because of his commission structure. It sounded reasonable. Everything Ethan said sounded reasonable. That was his gift. The pregnancy was planned, or at least I thought it was. I wanted a family. Ethan seemed to want the same thing. He talked about it in the specific, tender way that felt genuine. Names he liked, neighborhoods with good schools, how his father had coached his little league team. He painted a picture of a man who intended to be present. The paint, it turned out, was all he had. The first shift happened around month 5. Ethan's mother, Joan Cross, began arriving unannounced. She lived 90 minutes away in a house that her late husband had paid off before he died, and she had the particular energy of a woman who had been widowed early and transferred every ounce of her emotional architecture onto her only son. She was polite to me in the way that people are polite when they consider you a temporary feature of a room they intend to redecorate. Joan started with the nursery. She brought swatches, unsolicited. She rearranged the closet while I was at work and left a note that said, "Much better flow now." She told Ethan in front of me that she'd be staying weekends after the baby arrived to make sure things are handled properly. The implication was clear. Things meant me. Ethan didn't push back. He said his mother was excited. He said she meant well. He said I was being hormonal, which is a word that men use when they want to reclassify your perception as a symptom. I stopped arguing. Not because I agreed, but because I was working full-time, pregnant, managing a gala season, and didn't have the energy to fight a war on 2 fronts. I chose the wrong battle to surrender. The second shift happened at month 7. I came home from a doctor's appointment routine glucose test, everything normal, and found Joan sitting at my dining room table with a stack of printed documents. She looked up as if I'd interrupted something. Ethan was next to her, laptop open, and they both closed their screens when I walked in. "Just going over some planning stuff," Ethan said, smiling. He had a particular smile for moments like this, warm and closed at the same time, the kind that answers a question by making you feel foolish for asking it. I nodded and went to the kitchen to make tea. I didn't ask what they were planning. I told myself it was probably nursery logistics, baby-proofing schedules, maybe a meal prep plan for the first weeks after delivery. I told myself a lot of things during those months. Most of them were wrong. The third shift, the one that cracked everything, happened at 31 weeks. Diane insisted on throwing me a baby shower. She hosted it at my house, which made sense, and she invited 26 people, including Joan, which I'd asked her to do because I was still, at that point, trying to maintain the fiction that my mother-in-law and I were building something. The shower was beautiful. Diane had done the flowers herself, white ranunculus and eucalyptus. Simple. The kind of arrangement that looks effortless because someone very competent made it that way. There were finger sandwiches and sparkling cider and a cake shaped like a crescent moon because that's what I'd been calling the baby. My little moon. I was in the living living room, sitting in the chair Diane had positioned by the window because the afternoon light was good for photos, opening a gift, a hand-knitted blanket from one of my coworkers when I heard Ethan's voice from the kitchen. The kitchen in my house has an odd acoustic property. The archway between the kitchen and dining room creates a channel that carries sound in a way the builder probably didn't intend. If you stand in the right spot near the dining room entrance, you can hear a whisper from the far counter as if the person is standing next to you. Diane knew this. She had been walking toward the kitchen to refill the cider pitcher when she stopped in the archway, pitcher in hand, and heard what I heard. Ethan's voice, low and casual, the register he used when he was being strategic. Once the baby's here, we don't need her anymore. Then Joan's voice, quieter but perfectly clear. The house is the important thing. We secure that first, then the accounts. Then Ethan again. She has no idea about the filing. Marcus is drawing up the papers this week. Postpartum, she won't fight it. She'll be too tired, too emotional. We give her 60 days and she signs whatever we put in front of her. I was holding the blanket. I remember the texture under my fingers. Soft, cream-colored wool, made by someone who had spent hours on every row because they cared about my baby. I looked down at it and heard my husband describe the plan to dismantle my life with the same flat confidence he used to talk about quarterly projections. Diane set the pitcher down. She didn't make a sound. She looked at me across the room, and I looked at her, and something passed between us that didn't need words. It was the look of two women who had just understood the same thing at the same moment, that the threat was not emotional, it was procedural, and it required a procedural response. The shower continued for another hour and 40 minutes. I opened every gift. I smiled. I thanked people. I ate a slice of cake and told Joan it was delicious when she pointed out that she'd suggested the bakery. I performed the afternoon with the precision of someone who understood, suddenly and completely, that every minute I spent looking normal was a minute I was buying for what came next. Diane left last. She stayed after everyone else had gone, standing in my kitchen with her coat on and her keys in her hand, and said 5 words. I know what I heard. I know, I said. I need you to call Renata. Renata Osei was the attorney Diane had worked with for 15 years on the family court bench. She specialized in domestic financial abuse, marital fraud, and the kind of quiet, surgical legal work that doesn't make noise until it's already finished. I called her the next morning at 7:14 a.m. She answered on the second ring. Tell me everything, she said. Don't leave anything out, and don't soften it. I talked for 55 minutes. She asked 4 questions. When I finished, she said, I need 3 things from you. First, your property records, mortgage documents, and any financial accounts in your name only. Second, your marriage certificate and any joint accounts, if they exist. Third, I need you to behave normally for exactly 14 days. Can you do that? I can do that. Good. Because what your husband and his mother are planning is not a divorce strategy. It's fraud, and I would like to be the person who explains that to them. The 14 days were the longest of my life. I went to work, I came home, I cooked dinner. I sat next to Ethan on the couch and watched television and let him put his hand on my belly and say things about the baby that I now heard differently. Every tender comment, every plan he described, I filtered through the kitchen conversation and heard the machinery underneath. He wasn't planning a nursery. He was planning an acquisition. On day 3, Ethan came home with a onesie that said, Daddy's girl. He held it up with the expression of a man rehearsing tenderness. I smiled and said it was perfect and felt my stomach turn not from the pregnancy, from the performance. He folded it carefully and placed it in the nursery. Joan had reorganized. I let him. On day 5, Joan called to discuss the birth plan. She wanted to be in the delivery room. She said it casually, as if it were already decided. The way she said everything, as though disagreement was a form of confusion on my part. I said we'd talk about it. Ethan texted me an hour later. Don't upset her. She just wants to be involved. I read the text 3 times. Each time the word involved meant something different. On day 8, I woke at 3 a.m. and found Ethan downstairs on his phone. He was sitting at the kitchen island in the dark, the screen light carving shadows into his face. He saw me and locked the screen. Couldn't sleep, he said. Commission stuff. I got a glass of water and went back to bed and lay there for an hour counting the baby's kicks and thinking about the phrase, we don't need her anymore, and the way it had come out of his mouth like a line item, something between file the papers and pick up dry cleaning. On day 11, Ethan suggested we take a drive to look at houses in a new development south of the city. Bigger yards, he said. Better schools. A fresh start. He described it the way he described everything, with that frictionless confidence that made questions feel unnecessary. I said it sounded nice. I didn't mention that the house we lived in, the one he wanted to leave, was mine. I didn't mention that I knew exactly why he wanted us in a new house, one with both names on the deed, one that would be marital property. I smiled and said we should look after the baby came. He squeezed my hand. You're going to love it. Meanwhile, Renata was building. She'd pulled the property records and confirmed what I already knew. The house was mine. Purchased 18 months before our marriage, never added to any joint filing. She ran a title search and found something I did not know. Ethan had contacted a title company 4 months earlier and inquired about adding his name to the deed. The company had flagged the request as incomplete because it required my signature, which he hadn't obtained. He'd followed up twice. The second inquiry was dated 3 days after he learned I was pregnant. She checked the joint account we used for household expenses, the only shared account we had. In the last 6 months, Ethan had made 17 transfers from that account to a personal account at a different bank, totaling $43,000. The household account was funded almost entirely by my salary. She found the attorney, Marcus Devlin, family law, based in Raleigh. Renata called him attorney to attorney and, without revealing specifics, asked a series of procedural questions that Marcus answered in a way that confirmed he was, in fact, preparing a filing. Renata described his tone as enthusiastic and underinformed, which she said was her favorite combination in opposing counsel. On day 12, Diane made a phone call, not to a lawyer, to a forensic accountant named Wallace Chen, who had testified as an expert witness in her courtroom more times than either of them could count. Wallace spent 48 hours with my financial records and Ethan's, which Renata had subpoenaed through an emergency filing that Ethan's attorney hadn't flagged yet because it was sealed. He found the 17 transfers. He also found 3 credit cards opened in my name without my authorization, carrying a combined balance of $27,400. The charges were for furniture, electronics, a golf club membership, and 2 business dinners at restaurants I'd never been to. On day 14, which was a Wednesday, Renata filed. She filed 4 things simultaneously: a petition for an emergency protective order based on financial abuse and identity fraud, a criminal referral to the Mecklenburg County DA's office for the unauthorized credit accounts, a motion to freeze all joint financial accounts pending investigation, and a cease and desist to Marcus Devlin's office regarding any filing that relied on the fraudulent premise that Ethan had property rights to my home. Ethan found out at 9:20 a.m. On a Thursday, he was at his office. I know the exact time because Renata texted me, served, both of them. Joan was served at her house at 9:22 a.m. by a process server who later told Renata that Joan had opened the door in a bathrobe and read the first page standing in the doorway without moving. Ethan called me 11 times that day. I answered none of them. I watched his name appear and disappear on my screen the way you watch a weather system on a radar, moving, predictable, no longer dangerous. He texted twice. The first said, "We need to talk." The second, 3 hours later, "Sophie, this is serious." I read them both and set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and made lunch. He came home at 6:15 p.m. I heard the garage door open, then the engine cutting off, then 14 seconds of silence before the car door opened. I think those 14 seconds were him reading the filing on his phone one more time, trying to find the angle. He walked through the door and saw me sitting at the dining room table, the same table where he and Joan had planned everything, with Diane sitting across from me and a copy of the filing in the center of the table, like a centerpiece. The flowers from the baby shower were still on the kitchen counter, white ranunculus, 3 days old, and just starting to curl at the edges. "What is this?" he said, picking it up. His hands were steady. I'll give him that. The performance held for another 4 seconds. "That's everything you were going to do to me," I said. "Documented, filed, and now in the possession of a judge who specializes in exactly this." He turned to the second page, the third. His jaw tightened on page 4, which was the title company inquiry. By page 6, the credit cards, the performance was developing hairline fractures. By the time he reached the forensic accountant's summary on page 9, he set the whole thing down and looked at Diane. "This is your doing." Diane didn't speak. She just looked at him in the way I imagined she had looked at 1,000 men from her bench. Not with anger, not with pity. With the particular patience of someone who has watched enough people lie under oath that silence had become her most effective instrument. She folded her hands on the table. The silence was its own sentence. Ethan tried what men like him always try. He recalibrated. His voice went soft. The charm came back like a reflex, automatic, muscular, the way a salesman's handshake adjusts to match the grip of whoever he's shaking. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said his mother had been pressuring him, that she'd been in his ear for months, that he'd never intended to follow through. He said he'd been stressed. The market was difficult. The baby was making him anxious. He said he loved me. He said it twice, the second time quieter, as if volume were the variable that had been missing. "You contacted a title company to steal my house," I said. "You opened credit cards in my name. You told your mother I was disposable. Which part of that is love?" He didn't have an answer. He had a face, a very good face, the one he'd used at the gala, the one he'd used at our wedding, the one he probably practiced in mirrors. But faces don't hold up when the documents are on the table. He left that night. He went to Jones. The next morning, Marcus Devlin filed a response that Renata described as a very polite way of saying his client would like this to go away. Renata said no. She said she wanted discovery. She said she wanted depositions. She said she particularly wanted Joan under oath, on the record, answering questions about the kitchen conversation that Diane was fully prepared to testify she had witnessed. Marcus called back an hour later and asked what a reasonable settlement would look like. The criminal referral moved at its own pace. The DA's office assigned an investigator named Detective Laura Simmons, who had been working financial crimes for 9 years and had, Renata told me, a particular intolerance for cases involving pregnant women. She spent 3 weeks with the credit card evidence and called it, in her report, a textbook case of spousal identity theft. She interviewed 2 bank representatives. the title company employee who had handled Ethan's deed inquiry, and in a development that surprised everyone, Joan herself, who apparently believed that cooperating with the investigation would demonstrate her innocence. It demonstrated the opposite. Joan told Detective Simmons, on the record, that Ethan deserved to protect his investment in the marriage. Simmons included the quote in her final report, underlined. Ethan's attorney negotiated a plea arrangement that included full restitution for the credit card balances, 2 years of probation, and a notation on his financial services record that would follow him for the rest of his career. His brokerage license was placed under review. 2 of his commercial real estate clients dropped him the week the review was announced. A third called Renata's office directly and asked for a copy of the forensic report, which Renata declined to provide, but described to me as a very encouraging phone call. Joan called me once, 4 days after the filing. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 90 seconds of controlled fury. She said I'd ruined her son. She said I was ungrateful. She said she'd always known I wasn't good enough for him. She said the house should have been Ethan's from the beginning. She said mothers protect their children, and that everything she'd done had been out of love. The word love, in her mouth, sounded like a deed of ownership. I saved the voicemail. Not for me, for the attorney, and eventually, for my daughter, if she ever wants to understand why her grandmother isn't part of our lives. That night, I sat in the nursery at 2 a.m. in the rocking chair I'd bought at an estate sale 6 months before I met Ethan. It was the only piece of furniture Joan hadn't tried to replace. The moonlight was coming through the window, landing on the crib in the way that light does in rooms that are waiting for someone. I put my hand on my belly and felt her turn a slow, rolling movement, like she was getting comfortable in a space that was entirely hers. I thought about how Ethan had used the word need. Once the baby's here, we don't need her anymore. As if I were a vehicle that had delivered its cargo and could now be returned. As if the woman who carried her, who sang to her in the shower, who lay awake at night imagining her face, was incidental to the project. I realized, sitting there, that the grief I was feeling wasn't for the marriage. It was for the version of him I'd invented, the man who coached Little League. The man who wanted to look at houses with good schools. That man had never existed. He was a draft, a sketch, a set of talking points assembled for a specific audience. I had been the audience. And now the show was over. My daughter was born 6 weeks later, at 5:47 a.m., on a Tuesday, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with dark eyes and a grip that could crack a walnut. I named her Margot, after my mother. Diane was in the delivery room. She held my hand through the last hour and didn't say a word, which was the most eloquent thing she'd ever done. When Margot arrived and they put her on my chest, Diane looked at her for a long time, then looked at me and said, "She has your mother's chin." I couldn't speak. I just nodded and held my daughter and let the tears come because they were finally the right kind. Ethan was not in the room. He was not in the hospital. He had requested, through Marcus, to be present for the birth, and Renata had responded with a 3-page motion, citing the protective order and the ongoing criminal proceedings. Marcus did not file a reply. 8 months have passed. I am still in my house, the one I bought, the one I pay for, the one no one else's name has ever been on. The nursery is exactly how I want it. The closet is organized my way. The rocking chair from the estate sale is in the corner by the window, and that is where I sit with Margot at 6 a.m. Every morning before the day starts, watching the light come through the oak tree in the yard, that was the reason I bought this house in the first place. Margot is crawling now, mostly toward things she shouldn't touch, which is a quality I hope she keeps. Diane comes over every Saturday. She brings pastries from the bakery on 7th and unsolicited opinions about my curtains, and she sits on the floor with Margot and does the kind of laughing that comes from a place so deep it doesn't make sound right away. Last Saturday, Margot pulled herself up on Diane's knee for the first time. Diane looked at me with the expression of a woman who has seen 31 years of broken families from a bench and is now watching one being built on a living room floor. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Renata's office sends updates when there are updates. The financial recovery is complete. The credit accounts have been closed and removed from my record. The civil settlement was finalized in February. The amount is private, but I will say that it was more than enough to fund Margot's education through graduate school, if she wants it. The criminal case resulted in probation and mandatory financial counseling, which Ethan apparently attends every Thursday, though whether he is learning anything is a question I cannot answer and have stopped asking. I saw him once, 3 months ago, at a coffee shop I don't usually go to. He was sitting at a corner table with his laptop, and he looked smaller than I remembered, which I think is what happens when you strip away the performance and leave only the person. He saw me and started to stand. I shook my head once, just slightly, and he sat back down. That was the entire interaction. It was enough. Joan sends letters, handwritten, on cream stationery, addressed to the house she tried to take from me. Renata's office receives them, logs them, and files them without response. The last one, I'm told, was 4 pages long and included the sentence, "A mother's love should not be punished." Renata's paralegal flagged that one specifically, not for legal relevance, but because, she said, the lack of self-awareness is almost architectural. I think about the woman who stood in that living room at 31 weeks pregnant, holding a hand-knitted blanket and hearing her husband describe her as a temporary inconvenience. I think about how close it came, how 4 weeks and a slightly different floor plan in that kitchen could have changed everything, if the archway hadn't carried the sound, if Diane hadn't been walking to refill the cider, if I had been the woman Ethan believed I was too tired, too emotional, too soft to fight back. But I wasn't that woman. I was the woman who owned the house, who built the career, who raised the money and organized the gala and signed every check. I was the woman whose godmother was a retired judge with a very particular set of standards and a phone full of the right numbers. Ethan whispered to his mother that once the baby arrived, they wouldn't need me anymore. He was right about one thing: they don't need me. They never did. What they needed was what I had, and they mistook my generosity for access and my patience for surrender. My daughter is 8 months old. She has my mother's name and my godmother's stubbornness and a grip that says she's not letting go of anything that belongs to her. Neither am I.